Hello, everyone. I'm here today to talk a bit about consciousness. I did my undergraduate in psychology with a specialization in psychometrics, which is psychological tests and assessment, where you can reliably and validly measure a variety of psychological processes to ensure some type of quantifiable understanding of that. Uh, a couple examples of these measures would be the Wisconsin card sort, the California verbal learning test. A lot of people have done some degree of intelligence testing, things like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children or Wechsler Intelligence Scale for adults. Uh, it's a really interesting field, but all of it has to come down to some type of discussion of consciousness, which is the hard problem of philosophy today. There's many things we can run into with morality that can be riveting to explore, but consciousness in both a philosophical and a scientific sense is the hard problem. Now, I had listened to Sam Harris talk to David Chalmers, fantastic podcast, about an hour and 50 minutes, wonderful, a lot of really good content in there about consciousness from probably one of the leading minds in consciousness studies. So, what is consciousness? Let's kind of start there. There's a wide definition that really pertains to a variety of different fields. A lot of people think that consciousness is just being awake and aware. That's more of a medical definition of consciousness. The philosophical one that Harris and Chalmers used mostly based itself around not only just awareness and awake, but the experience of being, well, frankly, aware. Seeing green is the most prominent example they begin with, and it's also very common in epistemological circles, the image of the green field. That is the basis for consciousness. There is a unique experience to being you. How you look out at a field creates a unique experience, a consciousness, only to you. No one else has that identical experience. This is a reasonably good definition. It allows us to begin to explore from that point out on whether or not this is a top-down process, a bottom-up process, whether this is a common occurrence across not just humans but all species, across time. Actually, Chalmers quips at one point in here, the idea of I think therefore I am works very well, but that's a single data point. You can know you are conscious, but there's no way you can tell that anyone else is conscious. And in fact, there's no way you could tell you are conscious before this very moment you are listening to me speak. To try to deal with consciousness is really challenging now in this moment, because we have to put ourselves along this definition and try to determine, I think, the hottest debate in the field of, is it epiphenomenal or is it a separate process that has implications for the rest of one's experience? So starting with epiphenomenalism, that is where, using Sam Harris's example, the steam engine is the brain observing, processing, using and integrating data to make reasonable predictions, assessment, pattern recognition, and so forth, and that consciousness is merely the smoke coming out of the engine. Consciousness, in other words here, is a byproduct of the brain's operations. Your brain cannot help but have consciousness. The other side here is that consciousness is a unique process separate from the brain's other basal processes. And that's far more difficult to reconcile, simply because when you go down that route, you must begin to account for an evolutionary basis for consciousness. Why would, in best fitness, the brain have consciousness? I think that without being able to explain that at a human evolutionary level, it makes it highly improbable that consciousness at all could have evolved at any point in time, especially when we begin to propose creatures starting at the absolute highest order, being humans, and we work our way down to the lowest order. Humans, yes, conscious. I mean, most people here that are listening to this will probably agree that consciousness is something that humans have. Okay, high-level apes. Do chimpanzees, orangutans, apes, do they have consciousness? What about dogs, cats, dolphins? I know I'm still sticking in mammals right now, but do they have consciousness? What about all the way down? What about raccoons? Probably the most primitive mammal alive today. What about birds? A shark? Starting to get a little wobbly for a lot of people. They're having a difficult time probably agreeing that there is consciousness. Insects. Do insects have consciousness? They integrate data. They have visual processing. They have auditory processing in some cases. Not in the way that humans do, but their version of, using antennae to detect different pressure gradients. They integrate data. They react to things. Does that make them conscious? It's very difficult as you work your way from the top of the tree of life down to some of the lower level branches, which still exist today, to say that those lower branches are as conscious as humans, but their experience of consciousness is different. In other words, if you were to put your mind into that of a bat, would the light of consciousness go out? And frankly, I would personally would say no. No, it wouldn't. Why? Well, consciousness is, and I agree more with the epiphenomenal description of consciousness, the byproduct of your mental processes taking place. And it's not only the byproduct of, it's an active observance of those mental processes going and running their course. If you were to only be a creature which could react and have no way of making a determination or a choice on matters, I would not label you as conscious. A fly, in other words, is not conscious in my model, because a fly eats, flies away. If it sees motion, it flies away as self-preservation. The fly has no system of determining, do I feel like eating feces today or garbage today? The fly doesn't have a moment of saying, that hand is not that close, so I'm not going to fly away. It has no system, no ability, no structures that would facilitate an overview of decision making to adjust in the future. Learned behaviors, Pavlovian measures if you will, can influence how certain creatures act absolutely at a very reactionary level, but that also does not entail that they have consciousness. Consciousness as a problem in this case is placed on a gradient of degrees then. And there is a hard line which drawn out says anything below it is not conscious. I think you could say the insect kingdom as a whole, not conscious. Okay? The epiphenomenal side of it works well in almost every other instance. But when we look at insects, there is not enough neurons present within a fly, for example, to leave it a possibility that it has the ability to assess its information in anything but a reactive manner. In other words, think about the simplest of computer programs. When coded in a variety of if statements, when statements, loops, that it is so stringently coded that it will never do anything outside of itself. It cannot do anything outside of itself. Assume it's a perfect program, there's no bugs, and it will do nothing outside of itself. That is effectively what a fly is. Some people even argue that's what humans are, all the way at the top. I don't think so. I think we have far more control over our neural processes than people believe, but that may be a discussion for a little later down in this topic. I don't want to go on too long about this. It is a very long discussion to listen to, but continuing on with the point of epiphenomenalism and where that hard line is, you need to have a particular degree of processing capability in order to be conscious. Some people posit, even in this conversation here, that consciousness is just inherent to matter, that all matter has consciousness, which makes it very strange and difficult for me to be able to understand, because it's, one, extremely radical to think that the atoms that make up your computer chair have atoms that are thinking. Well, not thinking, but an experience. Those atoms are actually experiencing. There's a consciousness. There's something which in that atom means to be that atom. But then that eventually goes down to points where not only the atom, but the constituent parts of that atom. What about the constituent parts of the constituent parts of the atom? What about the constituent parts of the constituent parts of the constituent parts of the constituent parts ad absurdum? Effectively arguing that the strings of strings of strings have a degree of consciousness which is inherent in it, and it works itself up there. I think that that is almost akin to a God argument, that there is a consciousness within this universe that exists at the absolute base level of its building blocks. I don't think that's possible. That's absurd to the maximum. Simply because there's energy does not mean there's consciousness in this discussion. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the philosophical side of things will come out and prove me absolutely wrong in the coming century. But I don't think that there's a reasonable basis for us to start believing that. I think consciousness really is something which requires observation, perception, in other words, data input that can be processed on more than just a stringent, straight line level. Epiphenomenalism, coming back to that, does not require us to account for why consciousness would have evolved. I really think that epiphenomenalism is the best idea because it explains that through our initial observations, the moment which you are waking up in the morning, you observing the environment, hearing the sound of your alarm, feeling the sheets on your body, smelling the coffee, all come together to create an experience of being you that also makes it possible for you to make decisions on that point. If you're up at 7 a.m., you might, or 6 a.m. we'll say, you might know that it's a weekday. I have to go to work, got to be there at 8:30 a.m. I'm up at 6 a.m. so I can get my day started. If you wake up and it's 8:30 a.m., you might say, it's a weekend. Okay, because you can observe and integrate that data through multiple systems in your brain to try to make reasonable predictions about what's going to happen. Dogs can have the same experience. They can wake up and determine, well, it's brighter out than normal, so it must be a weekend. They don't have a concept of weekend, but they know it's a day different from other days. And there could be a whole variety of reasons that build into their ability to have that assumption. But to assume that consciousness somehow acts as an additional force, not that it's just something that comes out of your brain working, I think begs too many questions down the line. It asks far more than it can answer. And in the realm of Occam's razor, we must eliminate the ones that effectively give us more questions than answers. Now, I want to quickly change gears here to a topic that might make it a little more understandable as to why I think that epiphenomenalism is a better explanation. And then I'll wrap up after that for those of you who probably have better things to do that listen to this video, despite the fact you can stop it and walk away at any time. Dreaming is the essence of what epiphenomenalism is about. So it's very difficult to argue that one is conscious while they're asleep, because there's no experience in the definition provided here by myself in the start of this video and Chalmers and Harris at the start of their podcast, that consciousness is something one can experience while they're asleep. We can experience being tired. We can experience a whole variety of elements and steps that take place prior to falling asleep, that some people, the sense of falling, visions at times, other sensory experiences as the brain's beginning to turn off or change wavelengths effectively. We can experience waking up. We can experience being very, very tired in the middle of the day, the heavy eyes like you just want to drift away. But we can't experience being asleep. Well, if we can't experience being asleep, surely that means consciousness just turns off for a while. But does it? Dreaming actually tells me that consciousness doesn't just turn off for a while. Okay, now this is going to get a little strange here in the explanation of what I think dreaming effectively is. And there is some reasonable scientific evidence that supports this. So why do we need to sleep? We need to sleep because the brain has to have a process by which it can cleanse itself of its daily activities in order to keep itself fresh. That is why individuals who do not sleep for multiple days in a row will eventually just die. Effectively, you build up gunk in there. You do not have a clean processing system. Your body cannot recycle any of its spent neurochemical material. You run out. You block up, you die. That's why we need to sleep. So how does the brain go about doing this? Well, the brain is effectively pressurized and awash with cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid helps with the cleansing process. Your brain is comprised of a variety of different cells, but I'll just do the most simplest explanation right now. You have white and gray matter. Gray matter is glial cells. Glial cells are these fantastic little bonders and cleaners of your brain. They do not help with your thinking beyond the fact that they just create the structure for which the neurons can work through and keep everything clean around them. Your glial cells can actually, as we've learned in the last about 4 years here through a pretty good study, expand and contract to create more flow of CSF to ensure greater cleaning of the brain. This minor act, while almost immeasurable, does facilitate a clean brain process. It's almost like a simple shutdown and cleansing that you would see for hospitals in the event of cleaning out an isolation room, right? It's a process that you can, sure, during the day you can wipe it down with bleach wipes, but you really need to shut that room down for a period of time between patients to make sure you can thoroughly clean everything and make sure there's no contaminated items left behind that may pose a risk to the following patient. What else do we know about the brain that's really, really interesting? And this, for my Canadian friends, you'll remember from a heritage moment where a neurosurgeon has a woman's head open and he is physically pressing on her brain where she begins smelling burnt toast. She was an epileptic, and they felt that they could, if by manipulating parts of the brain, either by physically pressing into it or using electrodes, they can stimulate particular activities of the brain. The glial cells moving back and forth will invariably cause neurons to fire. That pressure on the neuron can cause it to fire. It can stimulate the neuron enough to have it fire. So you're asleep. Your glial cells are contracting and expanding to increase cerebrospinal fluid flow through the brain to clean it out. All these neurons are firing. Your prefrontal cortex is not something that chooses to work. Okay? This is a particular structure that our brain has evolved, or has evolved in our brain, I should say, that has the role of higher order functioning. It assesses all the data inputs which we are currently receiving, not only from our sensory organs, but from our experiences, our knowledge, our words, everything is filtered through your prefrontal cortex to assess, to give you an output of reasoned experience. That effectively is your consciousness. Although it isn't consciousness, do not confuse the prefrontal cortex with the consciousness center. It does manage higher order functioning, which is central, but it is not your consciousness center. Anyways, so all these neurons are firing in your brain as your brain's being cleaned, and your prefrontal cortex just is like, hey, there's information, I have to process it. And it's processing, it's processing, it's processing, it's processing. You are not conscious. You are asleep. You have zero awareness of this happening. Your prefrontal cortex is working because it's assessing information. So, dreams. How does this come to dreams? During REM sleep, you dream. And during REM sleep, while you dream, you are experiencing your prefrontal cortex assessing all the information that it is going through. That is why you get crazy dreams, where a part of your brain might be getting cleaned that has to do with fear response. And a part of your brain might be being cleaned to do with, I don't know, what's something benign for a lot of people, with giraffes. Images of giraffes. Maybe you watch a National Geographic video 4 months ago that had to do with giraffes and trampling people. And because the fear sent, this particular cluster of neurons that deal with fear is being stimulated, and because giraffes are being stimulated, and because a particular part of your brain that deals with a lot of excitement, like a party, for example, you dream of yourself at a party where you are about to be trampled by giraffes. Why would you dream that? That is not an experience most people living in the West will ever come across, to be trampled down by a herd of giraffes, or a gaggle of giraffes. What is that one? Anyways, but your brain processes the information for which it has available to it. Is that consciousness? In essence, yes, that fits the definition we started with. It is that unique experience of oneself based upon data integration and sensory input being processed. But it is not something you are consciously doing. So an epiphenomenalism description or explanation of consciousness, I think, does a very good job of explaining where consciousness is at in the larger discussion, philosophical discussion of consciousness. Anyways, thank you all for listening. I hope you have a wonderful week. See you soon.